A girl got accused of smuggling drugs just because she didn't look like she belonged in business class. The staff pushed it way too far until she made a call to her dad. What they weren't expecting? Chuck Norris on the other end. Let's get into it. Is that really your ticket, sweetheart? Or are you just borrowing it from someone who actually belongs up here? The woman's voice was slow and snide, like she'd said the same line to 100 people. Her name tag read Tina, crooked on a faded airport vest. She gave Emily a once-over, clearly enjoying herself. Emily stayed cool. She handed over her boarding pass and ID. She'd faced worse, but this was something else. Tina wasn't just skeptical. She looked entertained. Her eyes narrowed as she looked at the ID. "Oh, would you look at that?" she said with a little laugh. "Emily Norris, huh?" Emily nodded. "Yeah." Tina tilted her head. "Let me guess, going to some kind of karate thing?" "Martial arts camp in Chicago," Emily replied calmly. Tina scoffed. "And your daddy signed you up for that? What, he thinks he's Chuck Norris or something?" "He is Chuck Norris," Emily said, completely serious. Tina lost it, laughed so loud and sharp it made people in line glance over. "Please," she managed through the laughter. "You expect me to buy that? You think slapping Norris on your ID makes you royalty?" Emily didn't respond. Her face was calm, but her hands were clenched behind the counter. Tina leaned in, her voice suddenly syrupy. "You know what I think? I think you stole that ticket. Maybe you're running a scam, or worse." She tilted her head. "You hiding something in that bag? You're all quiet, all polite. That makes me nervous." "What? No," Emily said, confused. Tina didn't let her finish. She faked another glance at the ID and subtly hit a button under the counter. "I've seen your type," she said, loud enough for others to hear. "Smart little girls thinking they can outsmart airport security." Emily glanced toward the corner. 2 security guys were headed her way. "This is a mistake," she said quickly. "I'm not lying. I can show you my email confirmation, my ticket." "Let security handle it, sweetie," Tina said, suddenly stepping back like Emily might be dangerous. "I don't deal with drug runners." "Drug? What are you talking about?" Emily's voice cracked, not from fear, but from total disbelief. "I'm 17. I'm just—" "Ma'am, step away from the counter." One of the guards barked. They didn't ask questions. One grabbed her bag, the other her arms. Emily stumbled as they pulled her back. "Wait, I can explain," she cried out, but they were already going through her stuff. Her notebook, gloves, a small bottle of shampoo, all dumped out without care. Her uniform, her GI, tossed aside like trash. One of them sniffed a rolled-up wrist wrap. Tina chimed in, smug as ever. "TSA flagged her earlier. Let her through, but I had a gut feeling." Emily bit her lip, holding back tears. She wasn't giving them the satisfaction. Another pocket got opened. Protein bars, loose change, and then a small bottle. "What's this?" the guard asked. "My muscle recovery spray," Emily whispered. "It's for soreness." He looked at her like he didn't believe a word. "Might need to test it." "I'm not hiding anything. I'm not a criminal," Emily said. "My dad's on his way. He'll explain everything." "Yeah?" said the other guard. "And I'm Bruce Lee." Tina laughed again. No one listened. No one gave her a chance. All they saw was someone who didn't fit the picture of a business-class passenger. Someone quiet, wearing a hoodie, with a famous last name no one believed. Just before it all went downhill, her phone had buzzed in her pocket. She stepped aside, leaned against a wall, and picked up. "Hey, Dad," she said with a soft smile. On the other end, Chuck Norris answered, his voice calm, steady, and about to change everything. "You sure you don't want me to come with you, Pumpkin? I could catch the next flight and be there in 20 minutes. Emily let out a quiet laugh. "Dad, if you show up at LAX, you know what'll happen. I won't even make it to the gate. You've got paparazzi glued to you like glitter." There was a pause. He didn't want to admit it, but she was right. "Still don't like the idea of you flying alone, not with a bunch of strangers." "I'm okay," she said softly. "I need to do this on my own, just this once. Trust me?" Another silence, longer this time. "Okay," Chuck said at last, reluctantly. "But promise me you'll call the second you land." "I mean it, Emily." "I will," she promised. "Love you. Love you more." She ended the call, slipped her phone back into her pocket, and stood a little taller. But now, just minutes later, she regretted not letting him come. Her bag had been torn open, and everything was spilling out across the floor. Shirts folded neatly, sweatpants rolled up tight, a pouch of toiletries, her practice gloves. Then, as if the universe decided to make the moment as humiliating as possible, out came a soft bra, followed by 2 pairs of underwear, one plain, the other a painfully bright pink she'd tossed in that morning without thinking. They flopped to the ground with a soft, weightless thud. Emily felt her breath catch, like someone had slammed a fist into her chest. She blinked hard, then dropped to her knees, frantically gathering everything before anyone else could notice. Her fingers shook as she scrambled to hide them. Her face was burning. One pair had slid near the edge of the security line. A man standing just outside saw it, looked away quickly, pretending he hadn't. Emily snatched them back, shoving the underwear into the lining of her jacket. She didn't look up. She didn't want to see the stairs. Her hands were still trembling as she tried to zip the pocket shut. Behind her, she heard another zipper being pulled open. "Backpack too," one of the guards said. "I'll open it," she said quickly, already reaching to hand it over. But the guard yanked it off her shoulder before she could. The strap tugged hard, jerking her body with it. "Please, just be careful," she said as he grabbed both zippers and yanked them open. Everything inside tumbled out. Her journal, a folded martial arts gi top, loose pens, protein bars, and finally, near the bottom, the one item she'd packed with special care, a small ceramic mug. It slid out slowly, like even gravity hesitated. Then it fell. It rolled, once, twice, then hit the tile. The crack was quiet, like glass under pressure. Then it shattered, breaking into jagged pieces that skittered across the floor and stopped at her shoes. Emily stared. 1 second, 2. Then she dropped to her knees, not out of weakness, but reflex, reaching out as if she could somehow undo what had just happened. "No, no, no, please." Her voice was small, too quiet to match the sound of the break. "That was a keepsake from my late father." Behind her, a guard muttered, "Geez, it's just a mug." She didn't move. Her hands hovered near the shards, fingers curled like she didn't know whether to pick them up or just let them be. Then came the voice again, that same syrupy tone full of poison. "Well, that's weird," Tina said, arms folded tight as she leaned against the wall. "Didn't you say your dad's Chuck Norris?" Emily didn't respond. Couldn't. Tina stepped forward. "So which is it, sweetheart? Your dad some action movie legend? Or some dead guy with a broken coffee mug?" Still no answer. Tina smirked. "Kinda messy story, huh?" Something snapped, not in the mug, in Emily. She rose to her feet. Her breathing was fast, but her eyes were sharp, steady. Her fists clenched, and for the first time since she stepped into that airport, she didn't feel scared or embarrassed. She felt fire, a deep, growing rage that started in her gut and rose through her chest, filling her lungs, her fists. Before the first officer even realized she'd moved, her legs swept out low in a sharp, clean arc. His knees gave out. He dropped like a rock. The second lunged toward her. She twisted, used his momentum, sent him crashing into a stack of plastic bins. Gasps, shouts, a scream. The third man was bigger. He caught her arm mid-swing and twisted hard. Emily gritted her teeth and drove her elbow into his side. He held on, but she wasn't done. The fourth guard grabbed her from behind, arms wrapped tight around her waist, dragging her back and holding her down. She kicked, once, twice, but they had her locked in. 4 grown men on one teenage girl. Her arms were forced behind her, her legs flailing as she let out a raw, wordless scream. It wasn't just about breaking free anymore. She was fighting to be seen, to be heard. Then, as if the chaos peeled back, a single voice cut through it all, calm, deep, and firm. "That's enough." The guards froze. Heavy breathing filled the space, their hands still gripping her arms, shoulders, waist. Click, click, click. The sound of hard shoes striking tile echoed through the terminal. A man in a dark gray blazer approached, his posture straight and controlled, the kind of presence that didn't shout for attention, it just took it. His eyes, cold and steady, swept over the scene. Spilled clothes, overturned bins, a ripped backpack, shattered ceramic scattered across the floor. And Emily, crouched like a trapped animal, struggling to breathe. Behind him stood a few younger guards, alert and clearly waiting for orders. "My name is Charles," the man said evenly. "I'm the terminal supervisor." The officers started talking over each other. One mentioned an alert. Another claimed she got violent. Someone tried to say she was provoked. Charles lifted a hand. Silence. Then he looked at Emily. "Can you stand?" She didn't answer. Her arms were still being held tight. "I said let her go," he repeated, this time firmer, the hands released. Emily slid to her knees, then pushed herself up slowly. Her jacket had slipped off one shoulder. Sweat soaked through her shirt. Her palm had a small smear of blood. She didn't say a word. She didn't cry. She just stood there, silent and still. Charles looked at her, then glanced down at a large piece of broken ceramic on the ground. He bent, picked it up carefully, reading the words printed across it. "Family honor," split clean in 2. He stood again, met her eyes. "Let's go talk. Somewhere quieter." She gave a small nod and stepped over the mess, barefoot, one shoe missing, and nothing left in her bag that wasn't broken or taken. Emily thought the worst part was behind her, but the airport, or fate, had other plans. "Miss Norris?" She turned. "Come with me," Charles said, polite in tone, but clearly not giving her a choice. She hesitated, tightening her grip on the strap of her torn backpack. "What's the issue?" she asked, not angry but careful, trying not to trigger anything. Charles didn't answer right away. He led her to a nearby service counter, slightly away from the crowd, though a few people still glanced over from their phones, half watching. "We've encountered an issue with your booking," he said. "Some irregularities we need to sort out." Her brows drew together. "I already checked in. Went through security hours ago." "Yes," he replied. "But now I'm reviewing whether you were actually authorized to be on this flight. Business class, right?" "Yes." "Flying solo, age 17. "Yes." He tapped a tablet slowly, scrolling like he was waiting for something to jump out at him. "We believe this ticket may have been issued in error. possibly purchased under false pretenses. Emily's expression tightened. It wasn't. I'll need to see the credit card used, a valid ID, and the device or email that confirms the booking. She opened her phone immediately, pulling up the itinerary her dad had sent. My dad booked it. Chuck Norris. I have the confirmation right here. Charles stopped, lifting his eyes. I'm sorry, did you say Chuck Norris? She nodded. He let out a short laugh, more sarcastic than amused. Of course you did. Why not? He turned the screen toward her. It showed her name, the flight, seat details. The credit card name was masked, like usual, a basic system precaution, but he leaned into it. As you can see, we can't verify the payment from this, he said flatly. I can text him, she offered. He's on his way. He'll be here any minute. Charles let out a slow breath, like he'd heard it all before. Let me guess, he'll roll up in a black SUV with Secret Service, right? His tone dripped with sarcasm. Emily blinked. She heard it loud and clear. Not just doubt, but judgment. The kind that said, you're lying, you don't belong, you don't deserve this seat. I'm telling the truth, she said softly. He didn't respond. Another staff member whispered something in his ear. Charles turned back to his screen. I'm sorry, he said, though his voice lacked any hint of sympathy. Until we can confirm full payment and identification, your boarding is denied. She stared at him. You're canceling my ticket? It's being held, he said, like it meant nothing. Pending verification. We reserve the right to restrict access if there's any suspicion of fraud or misrepresentation. I'm not lying. I didn't steal anything. That's my real name. My dad, Emily stopped. Her hands had started shaking again. I'm not going to argue with you, Charles said, cool and detached. If the person who paid for the ticket wants to speak with us in person, we'll reevaluate. Until then, I need you to step aside. She didn't move. Charles gave a short nod to the two nearby agents. Escort her out of the boarding area. No, wait, she said quickly, her breath catching. You can't just... You can call whoever you need to from the public terminal, he said flatly. If your ticket's reinstated, you'll have to go through security again. Have a nice day. The words hit harder than a shove. One of the agents stepped forward, giving a small gesture toward the corridor. Let's go, miss. She didn't resist, not because she agreed with any of it, but because she had nothing left to fight with. She walked between the agents in silence, her steps echoing against the shiny tile floor. Her eyes burned, not from crying, but from holding it in too long. People turned to watch. Some remembered her from earlier, some whispered. Others pretended they didn't see, eyes glued to their phones. The hallway opened up toward baggage claim. The agent beside her walked a little too fast, clearly wanting to be done with it. The one behind her stayed quiet. By the time they reached the glass doors near the exit, Emily stopped walking. Her knees were unsteady, and her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out with numb fingers. The screen lit up. Dad calling. She answered on the second ring. Dad? Chuck's voice came through low and steady. Emily? What's going on? They took my ticket, she whispered. Her voice cracked halfway. They said it was fake. They didn't believe me. They said you had to fix it in person. Silence. Then, where are you? They're taking me to baggage claim. Stay put, he said firmly. Don't move. I'll be there in 10. She nodded, even though he couldn't see it. Okay? I mean it, baby girl. Stay right where you are. The call ended. She stood there for a moment, staring through the glass at the people coming and going, Families, luggage, laughing kids, the doors opening and closing like the airport was breathing without her. The agents started to walk again, but she didn't follow. She turned, leaned back against the cold metal railing, and slowly lowered herself to the floor, knees tucked to her chest, forehead resting on them. She didn't care who saw. Let them look. Let them whisper. Let them film. She was done trying to prove anything to people who didn't want to hear it. She stayed there, still, until the sound of heavy, confident footsteps filled the space. Conversations went quiet. Heads turned. Phones lifted. Even the agents behind her tensed. Emily lifted her head. There he was, Chuck Norris. Not a movie, not a joke. Right there, in real life. He walked in slowly, deliberately. Worn gray jacket, dark jeans, old sneakers, no entourage. No cameras, just him. But his presence was impossible to ignore. He didn't say anything at first. He just walked over to her and held out his hand. "You okay?" She nodded, but tears welled up anyway. She took his hand. Then he turned to the agents behind her, and his voice hit like steel. "Someone better start explaining, right now." Chuck stood still, hands at his sides, eyes locked forward. His gaze followed the man stepping toward them, Charles, the supervisor, who now looked nothing like he had before. His steps were smaller, shoulders tight, face pale. His jacket was slightly off-center, like he'd thrown it back on in a rush. Sweat clung to his forehead. He stopped in front of Chuck and extended a hand, fingers slightly trembling. "Mr. Norris, sir, I am deeply sorry about what happened today." Chuck didn't take his hand. He glanced at it, then looked up and straight into Charles's eyes. "You're the one who canceled her ticket?" Charles swallowed hard. "Yes, sir. I received an alert in our system and I followed standard procedure, but clearly I should have looked into it further." Chuck's voice lowered. "Standard procedure?" He took a step closer, not fast, just one, and Charles instinctively stepped back. "Was humiliating a 17-year-old part of that procedure?" Charles's voice shook. "No, sir. Absolutely not. I didn't know she was your—" Chuck didn't say anything. He didn't need to. His presence said enough. "She told you who she was," Chuck said, his voice quiet but sharp enough to cut through every sound in the terminal. "She showed her ID, her boarding pass, her name, but all you saw was someone who didn't fit your idea of who belongs in business class." I admit I made assumptions," Charles replied, barely above a whisper now. "Bad ones. And I regret them deeply. I've already told the team to reinstate her ticket, sir. I'll upgrade her seat if needed. I'll speak with the entire floor staff myself about what happened." Chuck didn't flinch. "Is her name on the ticket?" "Yes, sir. Absolutely." "Who paid for it?" "Your name, sir. It's on the original purchase receipt. We didn't verify it properly." Chuck's eyes narrowed. "No, you didn't fail to verify. You failed to treat her with respect." Charles nodded quickly, like a man trying to hang on to his last shred of control. "You're absolutely right. That's on me. I've already informed upper management. I'll file the report myself. I'll take full responsibility." "Before or after the videos go viral?" Chuck asked, glancing at the small crowd forming behind them, half of them filming while pretending to text. Charles turned pale. "We'll handle it. We'll contact the media if necessary. Issue a formal statement. We'll correct the record." Chuck raised a brow. "I'm not here for press releases." Charles lowered his voice, practically begging now. "Mr. Norris, please, if there's anything else I can do to make this right, I'm at your service. I'll personally escort your daughter through security. I'll stay with her until she's at the gate. I'll file disciplinary reports. Whatever you need." Chuck glanced back at Emily, who stood a few steps behind him, still a little shaken but fully tuned in to every word. By then, the room had started to quiet again, and then another man walked in. He wasn't tall. He didn't have the weight of fame like Chuck, but the second he entered, people made room. His blazer wasn't flashy, but it was neat, and his shoes clicked with a steady, purposeful rhythm. His name tag read Sir Henson, Regional Director. He walked straight toward Chuck, stopping at a respectful distance. His voice was calm, steady, the kind of calm that pulls the noise out of a room. "Mr. Norris, I'm truly sorry for what's happened here today." Chuck didn't answer right away. Henson glanced at Emily, then back to him. "We've reviewed everything," he continued. "I've already spoken to Charles and the other staff. There were failures across the board, poor judgment, broken procedures, and most importantly, a failure in basic human decency." Chuck gave a slow nod. "You're not wrong, and I appreciate you showing up, especially given how public this has become. We didn't come here for attention. We just wanted to board a flight." "I understand," Henson said. "Your daughter's ticket has been revalidated. Same seat, same class. She's also been placed on priority clearance for the rest of the day. No more gate delays, no more random screenings." Chuck glanced at Emily. She was quiet, her hands still tucked into her hoodie sleeves. She hadn't said much since earlier, but her eyes had that distant, shell-shocked look, still stuck in the moment the mug shattered, when people laughed, when no one believed her. "She'll be escorted to the plane through a secure lane," Henson added. "And if it's all right with you, I'd like to personally walk both of you to the terminal." Chuck nodded. "That'll work." Airport staff had backed off by now. A few avoided eye contact. Others stared at the glass wall where more travelers had gathered, filming, whispering, knowing they were witnessing something that wouldn't disappear in a day. Chuck turned to Henson, his voice still calm, but now with an edge that couldn't be missed. "Your people need to remember something." Henson waited. "My daughter wasn't asking for a handout. She wasn't trying to game the system. She walked in here with her own name, her own ticket, and her own story. And what she got back was doubt, humiliation, and treatment no one deserves. Not her. Not anyone." "You're absolutely right," Henson said, steady as ever. "And it's our job to make sure it never happens again. I'll be speaking to corporate. There will be changes, training, accountability." Chuck didn't nod. He just looked at the man and let the silence speak louder than words. Then he turned to Emily. She'd held it together for nearly 2 hours, through the stares, the shattered mug, the accusations, and the fight just to be believed. Now she looked up at him, trying to read his face. "You ready to go?" he asked. She nodded, quietly. Not much strength behind it, but enough. "Yeah," Henson said with a nod, motioning to one of the staff, who led them toward the lane marked priority access only. The crowd shifted again as they moved, whispers trailing behind them while phones lowered just enough to avoid being obvious. Emily followed just behind her dad, one hand gripping the torn strap of her backpack. She didn't glance at anyone, didn't make eye contact. She kept her gaze forward. Through the glass, past the metal detectors, beyond the security officers now giving her quiet, cautious nods. She was back on her feet, but barely. Inside the last checkpoint, where it was warmer and quieter, Chuck turned to her. "You did good." She gave a small smile, but it didn't hold. "Still feels bad," she admitted. "I know it's done, but I let it get to me." "You didn't let anything happen," Chuck said. "You were pushed." but I shouldn't have shown how much it got to me." He looked her in the eyes. "That's not weakness, Emily. That's called being human. Anyone who thinks they can treat people like dirt just because they wear a uniform or sit behind a desk, that's on them, not you." She didn't say anything, but her shoulders eased a little. Not a warrior or a celebrity's kid in that moment, just a girl walking next to her dad, heading toward something bigger than a boarding gate, heading toward something she earned. The boarding door was still open when Chuck looked down at her and made up his mind. "I'm coming with you." She blinked, caught off guard. "You don't have to. I can still go alone." Chuck shook his head. "After today? You're not getting on that plane without me next to you." There wasn't an ounce of doubt in his voice. Not because he didn't trust her, but because he did. But after everything she'd just been through, being dragged, questioned, stared at, dismissed, he wasn't about to let her face the rest of the day alone, still shaking and carrying invisible bruises. He walked over to the gate agent. Just one look, one quiet exchange, and a seat was found. That's what happened when your name still held weight. They boarded without a word, slipping into their row near the front. Most passengers were already buckled in, eyes on their phones or half listening to the pre-flight announcements. A few looked up, some curious, some holding phones, but Chuck ignored them all. He slid his bag under the seat, helped Emily with hers, and settled in just as the cabin doors closed with a solid click. The soft hum of the engines filled the space. Emily sat by the window, arms wrapped around herself. She didn't speak, didn't cry, just stared out at the sky through the smudged glass. In her lap sat a small white towel, folded and held gently in both hands. Inside, wrapped in layers of tissue, were the broken pieces of the mug. She hadn't let go of them since they left the terminal. Chuck watched her for a second, then leaned forward. "You planning to hold on to that the whole flight?" She didn't look over. "Yeah." "Let me see your hands." "I'm fine." "Let me see." She hesitated, then slowly opened her fingers. The cuts weren't deep, but they were there. Thin red lines across her palm, one still bleeding near her thumb. Chuck didn't say anything. He pulled out an old handkerchief from his jacket, frayed at the edges from years of use. Without asking, he took her hand and began cleaning the blood, slow and careful, like each touch hurt him more than it hurt her. She watched him quietly, eyes stinging. "You should have let someone help you," he said softly. "They didn't care," she whispered. "They just threw it." Chuck didn't answer right away. He folded the cloth over and kept wiping. His hands were steady, gentle. Emily's fingers slowly stopped trembling. When he finished, he held her hand a little longer. "You know," he said, eyes still on her palm, "you remind me so much of him." She looked over. "Who?" "Your dad." Her throat tightened. Chuck leaned back in his seat, voice softer now. He had this way about him, quiet, observant, wouldn't speak unless it mattered, but when he did, everyone listened. She didn't say a word. He was stubborn, too. You could argue with him all day, and he still wouldn't budge. But he didn't use that fire to pick fights. He used it to stand up, for people, especially the ones who couldn't do it for themselves. He just couldn't look the other way when something was wrong. Emily blinked, slowly. Chuck kept going. "There was this fire years ago. You weren't born yet. Old apartment building downtown. Whole place caught fast. Flames everywhere, people screaming. Fire trucks were late." He paused. "And your dad?" "He didn't wait. He just ran in." Her eyes widened a little. No hesitation, no plan. Just heard people were inside and charged straight into the smoke. Got 4 people out. A mom with a baby. 2 older guys who couldn't walk. Chuck's voice lowered to barely a breath. He didn't come out till everyone else did. He carried them out one by one. Emily covered her mouth with her hand. Chuck looked out the window for a moment, his voice a little softer now. But when he went back in for the fifth person, the roof came down. Emily closed her eyes tight. Chuck nodded slowly, calm but distant. He didn't make it out. But those people did, and that's who raised you. That's the blood running through your veins. The quiet between them stretched, heavy with everything they weren't saying. Emily looked down at the bundle in her lap, the broken pieces of the mug, sharp and small, sitting in the towel like they still mattered. Then she glanced at her wrapped hand, then up at Chuck. She didn't speak, she just leaned over and hugged him, hard. No hesitation, no holding back. She just collapsed into him like she'd finally run out of strength to hold the day on her shoulders. Her body trembled, her breath caught. Chuck wrapped one arm tightly around her and gently cradled the back of her head with the other. He didn't say a word. He just held her while the tears came. When they finally slowed, when her breathing softened, she whispered, "Thank you for coming, for staying, for not walking away." He kissed the top of her head. "I'm not going anywhere." She leaned back a little, her eyes red and swollen. "I'm sorry if I caused a scene." Chuck looked at her straight on. "You didn't cause a scene. You were thrown into one, and you stood tall through all of it." She tried to smile. It wavered. "I know I'm not your real—" He stopped her with a shake of his head. "You are," he said firmly. "Don't even finish that sentence. You're my daughter, in every way that matters." And that was it. Her face crumbled. She pulled him back into the hug, his chin resting softly on her hair. "To me," he said, voice barely above a whisper, "you'll always be that little girl I held the first time your mom let me. The one who ran barefoot to bring me water after training. The one who stared down the neighbor's pit bull at 5 like it was nothing." She laughed, the sound caught somewhere between joy and disbelief. "I remember that." "You looked him dead in the eyes," Chuck chuckled. "Dog turned and walked away like he didn't want the smoke." She laughed again, this time for real, wiping her cheeks with her sleeve. Chuck leaned back to look at her. His tone turned serious again. "You're strong, Emily, not just because you fight, but because you know why you fight, and you don't back down when it counts." She nodded. The plane rumbled louder as the engines kicked in. The wheels bumped forward along the runway. Chuck glanced at the towel in her lap. "Keep the pieces," he said. "It's okay if it's broken. Sometimes it's the broken things that remind us what really matters." She didn't say anything, just reached out and took his hand. This time, she didn't let go. And that, folks, is Emily Norris, the girl who carried more than a name. This story hit me deep. Maybe it did the same for you, because this wasn't just about airport security or fame or a mix-up with a boarding pass. It was about dignity, about being young and judged too quickly, about carrying something fragile, a name, a memory, a connection, and watching people try to crush it. But more than that, it's about someone showing up, not with fists or fury, but with love that doesn't flinch. Chuck Norris didn't show up with cameras flashing or entourages behind him. He showed up as a dad, as someone who stood between his daughter and the world, not to fight for her, but to stand with her, quietly, steadily. And let's be real, there's something beautiful in that, in how he cleaned her cuts, in how he said she was his, not because of blood, but because of heart. That's the kind of strength the world could use more of. And Emily? She didn't just survive that day. She didn't shrink. She rose. She walked out of it not in anyone's shadow, but in her own strength. If this story moved you like it moved me, drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. And if you haven't yet, hit like, share it with someone who needs it, and don't forget to subscribe for more true, heartfelt stories. Until next time, be kind, stand tall, and remember, sometimes the broken things are the ones that matter most, just like Emily's mug.